Hey everybody, welcome back to our series on the book of First Peter. We are in chapter 3, just about halfway through chapter 3, and today I want to talk about what these verses in First Peter chapter 3 are all about. Let's remember a little bit about where we are in the book of First Peter as a whole. The book of First Peter has 5 chapters. And really, we're kind of in this section here, starting in the middle of chapter 2 and going through chapter 4, verse 11. And in this part of the book, Peter is talking about how Christians interact with the world around them. And sometimes the world around Christians is not very kind to Christians. A lot of times there's a lot of persecution. And so how do Christians interact with a hostile world? And so Peter talked here about citizens, and then he talked about Christian slaves and Christian wives and husbands. Now, as we get into this part of this unit of the book, Peter is addressing all. You see that here in verse 8, where he says, finally, all of you. And so in this portion, Peter's addressing everyone, and he's basically saying this: God blesses those who live a righteous life instead of blessing those who seek revenge. You know, in so many ways, that is the message of the book of First Peter. First Peter has a lot to do about suffering, but it's all about how Christians are different. Christians don't get revenge. You can see here in pink that I've highlighted the different times in First Peter where it talks about Jesus suffering. Just notice this. You see Peter talking about how Jesus suffered in chapter 1, in chapter 2, in chapter 3, in chapter 4, and in chapter 5. And so that really is a key theme throughout all the book. Jesus set the example. He didn't look for revenge. As Christians, we aren't to seek revenge either. Today we're looking at chapter 3, verses 8 through 17. Let's start by talking about verses 8 through 12. Peter starts by saying this, saying, finally, all of you have, and he lists out 5 things: unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. This is how a godly Christian is to live, is to walk through life. Now, isn't it so interesting as you hear Peter's list here of what a mature Christian is like, but then you think about what Peter was like as you read the Gospels? I mean, here's the guy that rebukes Jesus, and the guy that cuts off a guy's ear, and then the guy that says, maybe everyone else is going to deny you, but I'll never deny you, and then he does. Peter, I think we see closer to the end of his life here, and he's matured a lot. He's saying this is what godly Christian character is really like. So live like this in the midst of a hostile world. Do that, but don't live like this. Don't repay evil. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling. Peter's going to be the guy, according to church history, that ends up a martyr, crucified upside down. And I think it's just so interesting how far he comes. He saw Jesus' example of suffering. Jesus didn't get revenge. So Peter says, don't repay evil for evil. Don't repay reviling for reviling. Instead, or on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. And that really is a key point here in 1 Peter. Peter is trying to tell us, when you don't get revenge, but instead you bless the persecutors, God blesses you in return. And so to support this point that God blesses the righteous, Peter quotes, and you're going to see that here in verses 10 through 12, Peter quotes some verses from Psalm 34. And this psalm here is basically just talking about how God blesses the righteous. So, verse 10, for whoever desires to love life and see good days, okay, sign me up for that, right? I want to see, I want to love life and see good days. what do you have to do? Well, you don't get revenge. Instead, you live a godly life. So you keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. So your tongue, your words, and then your actions. You want to see a good life, have your actions be holy. Turn away from evil, do good, seek peace, pursue it. So do you want to live a good life, a blessed life? Don't speak evil. Turn away from evil actions because God sees, right? God sees this. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous. His ears are open to their prayer. By the way, just remember back to what Paul said about husbands here, about this. If you don't show honor to your wife, your prayers might be hindered, right? But on the contrary, God's ears are open to the prayer of the righteous, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Okay, so this Psalm 34 is just backing up the point that he made in verse 9. Bless the persecutors so that you will obtain a blessing. Okay, that's verses 8 through 12. Now let's look at verses 13 through 17 as it kind of continues on this point. Peter asks this in verse 13. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? Normally in life, if someone is zealous for what is good, they're a man of integrity, a woman of integrity, they're not really persecuted. Normally it's the cheater or the liar that is punished. And that's just kind of how God set up the world. So Peter's saying you're blessed if you live a righteous life. But then we ask, but what if? What if? Sometimes you're persecuted even though you're living a righteous life. And so Peter addresses that right here in verse 14. But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, and that happens. Sometimes that happens with a Christian. Even if that happens, you will be blessed. And so a Christian is kind of in a unique scenario. A Christian really is in a win-win scenario. If you live a life of integrity, normally you're not the one that's being persecuted or punished. So that's a win. But even if you should suffer for living a righteous life, God will bless you. And so since you're in this win-win scenario as a Christian, Peter says this, have no fear of them, nor be troubled. I think the them is talking about the persecutors. So you're in a win-win scenario. God will bless you, Christian, if you live a righteous life. You don't need to get revenge, even if you suffer for doing what is right. Now, Peter says this in verse 15, and I've quoted verse 15. I think the NASB does a better job of translating it, so I'm include the NASB here in verse 15. He says this, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. In other words, in your heart, view Jesus as he really is. He is the Lord. Even if God allows suffering, even when you're doing righteousness, in your heart, realize God is the Lord. And I'm going to treat him, I'm going to accept whatever he allows. But listen, if you have hope, and if you're the kind of person that you're living a righteous life, and then you're persecuted, and you're still loyal to the Lord, people are going to start asking questions. And so that's what the rest of verse 15 is about, always being ready to make a defense to anyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. So when the questions come, why are you still loyal to God even though you're suffering? Be ready. See Jesus, view Jesus as the Lord, as the sovereign God, and also be ready at a moment's notice to defend the hope that's in you. But you're to do this with gentleness and respect. You know, there are people who want to defend what they believe with harshness and mockery. Christians, that's not us. That's not us. We're not to give a defense for the hope within us with harshness and mockery, but instead with gentleness and respect, even to those who are persecuting us. Okay, so that's verse 15. So we're to not be afraid. We're going to be blessed by God. We don't need to get revenge, and we need to view Jesus as Lord, and we need to always be ready to give a defense for the hope that's in us. And we are always to have a good conscience. We're to live a pure life, not always looking over our shoulders because of the sin we did. Because when you do that, what happens is that when people slander you, look what happens. When you live with a good conscience, though, like when you're slandered, the people who revile your good behavior in Christ, they're put to shame. Now, this is very similar to what we saw back in chapter 2, verse 12. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So almost the same idea here in verse 16. Watch how this ends, though. This is a stunning statement, what Peter says in verse 17. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. You don't get much credit in the Lord's eyes if you're really sinning and then you're just getting your natural consequences for that. But it's a good thing in God's eyes. It's an honorable thing if you suffer for doing righteousness. God is pleased with you not getting revenge. But notice this. Sometimes it's God's will that you suffer for doing what is good. There are some Christians who would say God's will is just only to bless you. It's only that you would live a good, happy, healthy, wealthy life. Friends, sometimes it's actually God's will. It's within His sovereign plan that you would suffer for doing what is good. And you know who did that? It's Jesus. It was actually the Father's design that though He lived a righteous life, yet He would be persecuted and would suffer. But in the end, Jesus is glorified. And that's really, as we zoom out and think about what Peter is saying here, that's a big part of what he's saying. He's saying, Christians, you might suffer now, but just like Jesus was righteous and then suffered and then was raised to glory, you too have that to look forward to. And that's what we're going to get into in our next session. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us in our walk through 1 Peter, and we will see you again next time.